Next, we're going to discuss something known as functional groups. Functional groups are small molecules that we typically find attached to larger molecules, such as a carbon backbone. Each functional group has certain characteristics and properties, and when they are attached to a larger molecule, they lend that larger molecule their properties, so they can affect how they behave. Here's a great example. Here we have estrogen and testosterone. These are two chemicals I am sure you've heard of before. Now you know that estrogen and testosterone can behave very differently inside a human body, but structurally they're very, very similar. They're both made of 4 large carbon-based rings, and really the only thing that makes them different from one another are the functional groups that are attached. Testosterone has a CH3 group, something called a methyl attached here, and something called a carbonyl attached over here, whereas estrogen has something called a hydroxyl attached here. And those tiny differences account for all the big differences in behavior that we know exist between these molecules. So functional groups can be very powerful. These are the 7 functional groups I would like you to know. We're going to go through them one at a time, but I would like you to be able to recognize with a diagram, and you should also know their characteristics. You'll find a chart on the guided notes that will help you summarize the information you need to know about the functional groups. As you work your way through the following slides, I suggest that you fill in any missing information, make a drawing of each functional group, and tell me which larger molecules we would find these functional groups attached to. You'll see the letters R and X used to replace some of the atomic symbols on the following diagrams. So what are those about? Well, in chemistry, R's and X's are wildcards. That means that this little molecule is attached to something, but we don't know what. It could be anything. And it's just an abbreviated way of writing a molecule. So when you see R or X, think attached to something, but we don't know what. Here's our first functional group, hydroxyl. A hydroxyl consists of an oxygen covalently bonded to a hydrogen, so hydroxyl. Let's identify them on a couple of other molecules. Here on the end of this carbon chain, there's a hydroxyl, an oxygen with a hydrogen. Here's another one on this molecule. Now, because we have sharing of electrons between an oxygen and a hydrogen, and because the sharing will be unequal, because the oxygen is very electronegative, hydroxyl groups are polar. Now remember that polar molecules like to mix with water, because water is also polar. Polar molecules like to mix with other polar molecules. So things with hydroxyl groups tend to be water soluble, at least partially. We find hydroxyl groups in molecules known as alcohols and in sugars. Let me show you a simple way to draw a hydroxyl group. Here we have an X, that's our unknown, an oxygen, a bond, a hydrogen. You can also abbreviate this as X connected to OH. Simple, hydroxyl. Here's an example of a molecule that's classified as an alcohol. Good old ethanol, drinking alcohol. Okay, here's its structure, and you can see that right here, there's a hydroxyl group. Now, because the hydroxyl group is attached to ethanol, that makes ethanol partially polar. Next, we have the carbonyl group, also known as the carbonyl group. I've heard it pronounced both ways. The key feature of a carbonyl group is a carbon with a double bond to an oxygen. Now, carbon can make 4 bonds, so 2 of the bonds go to the oxygen, and the other 2 go to 2 other things. And these can be any 2 other things. Here we have a molecule that has a couple of carbonyl groups. We have a carbon here, a carbon here, and a carbon here. And you'll notice that this carbon has that double bond to the oxygen, and so does this one. So this has two carbonyl groups. Now, carbonyls can be called either ketones or aldehydes, depending on their position within a molecule. If they occur on the end of a molecule, like they do here, okay, notice there's nothing any bigger than a hydrogen attached to the end of this. So we call that the end of the molecule. We call that thing an aldehyde. If the carbonyl, on the other hand, appears in the middle of a chain, as this one does here, we refer to that type of molecule as a ketone. Here's the full word, ketone. So these are both different kinds of carbonyl groups. Carbonyl groups are polar, so they are hydrophilic. They are water soluble. They do like to mix with water. Here's how I like to draw a carbonyl group. We start with a carbon in the center. As it shows here, connect it to two X's, that's two of the bonds. Oh, I'm terrible at that. And then put a double bond to a nice fat oxygen on top. There you go. You may have heard of molecules known as ketone bodies. So what are they, and how do they relate to what we've just learned? Well, in general, ketones are molecules, all of which contain carbonyl groups, and they contain the carbonyl groups in the center of the molecule. So here, for instance, we have a ketone. And you notice that here's that carbonyl group. There's the carbon and that double bonded oxygen, and they are both in the center of the molecule. That's the case for all three of these ketones. All of these circled areas represent carbons. So they're in the middle of the chain. Now, ketone bodies are a special category of ketone molecules. Doctors often use them as an indicator for certain things going on in the body. They're produced by the liver when the liver breaks down fat for energy. And so when someone's on a special kind of diet, like a ketosis diet, you can find these in higher levels in the blood or in the urine. They're also associated in higher levels with diabetes type 1 because the body's having difficulty processing sugar, so it's relying more on fats. And when people have certain types of liver issues, such as cirrhosis or other issues that can be caused by alcoholism, that can cause a rise in ketone bodies too. So this is something doctors look for to help them diagnose certain characteristics. These are the three major types of ketone bodies that are observed. You don't have to memorize them, but if I put one on a test, you should know that that carbonyl represents a ketone. Here we have some examples of aldehydes. Aldehydes are molecules that contain carbonyl groups as well, but the carbonyl groups are found on the end of the carbon chain rather than in the middle. Now, what do I mean by on the end? Here we have a tiny, tiny carbon chain consisting of a single carbon, and you'll notice that there's a hydrogen on either side. It's the smallest thing you can attach to this chain. So even if there's a hydrogen on the end there, we consider this to be the end of the molecule. So that counts as an aldehyde. Over here we have a chain of several carbons, and you notice that this carbonyl on the end only has a hydrogen attached to its other side, so we consider this to be the end of the molecule. Therefore, this is an aldehyde. Here we have a really big weird one, and again, that carbon with the double bonded oxygen is on the tip end of this molecule. So those are aldehydes. Again, you don't have to memorize these specific ones, but if I put something like this on a test, you should be able to identify where the carbonyl group is and that it constitutes an aldehyde. Next, we have the carboxyl group. Now, if you take the two previous functional groups that we talked about, the carbonyl and hydroxyl, and you combine them, you get the carboxyl. So the name kind of tells you what's involved. Carboxyl contains a carbon double bonded to an oxygen, that's the carbonyl portion, and then one of the bonds of the carbon in the center is going to be bound to a hydroxyl group. So that's carboxyl. Here on this molecule, we have the carboxyl here, again the double bonded O, and the hydroxyl, and then that carbon's going to be attached to a fourth thing, and it can be anything. Because the carboxyl group is a little complicated, sometimes you'll see it abbreviated as COOH, COO. So if you see that attached to a molecule, that's what it's talking about. Now, carboxyl groups are very polar. They are very hydrophilic, like the other groups we've talked about. They also are classified as acids. Now, why is that? Well, it's because they can exist in two forms, a non-ionized and an ionized form. Here's the non-ionized full form, and you'll notice that here's the little hydroxyl group. This hydroxyl group, under the right conditions, has the tendency to ditch its hydrogen. It'll kick that hydrogen out, and greedy oxygen will steal the electron from hydrogen. So hydrogen ends up being an ion, H+. Oxygen ends up having that negative sign. Now remember from chapter 3, anything that releases hydrogen into a solution is considered an acid. So this is why carboxyl groups are considered acids. Molecules that contain carboxyl groups are sometimes called carboxylic acids, and the ion that it produces is sometimes called a carboxylate ion. We find carboxyl groups in lots of places, but specifically we find them in amino acids and fatty acids, and that word acid should be a clue for you that it's probably got a carboxyl group. Here's how I like to draw a carboxyl group, and it's basically what the diagram shows up here at the top. You've got a carbon connected to something, an R or an X, connected to a double bonded oxygen here, connected to an OH, a hydroxyl group. There's your carboxyl. Here are a couple of examples of molecules that contain carboxyl groups. On the left-hand side, you've got lysine. Lysine is an amino acid, a building block of a protein. And if you look carefully, you'll see, oh, there's the carboxyl group. Carbon, double bonded oxygen, and a hydroxyl. On the right, we have a fatty acid. This is an important component of fats. And here's the ionized form of the carboxyl. If we added an H to the end of that and got rid of that negative sign, it might look more familiar. But that's a carboxyl group there as well. Next, we have the amine or amino group. Now, some of the previous functional groups were nice because their names kind of told you what atoms were involved. That's not the case with the amine amino group. The way that I remember what an amine or amino group contains is that these words contain the letter N, and the key component of an amine or amino is a nitrogen. So N for nitrogen, amine, amino has an N in it. An amino group consists of an NH2 or sometimes an NH3+, and we'll talk about that. So this is an amino group right here, NH2. Here's an NH2 as well. Those are amines. Now, amines or amino groups can act as bases. They are alkaline. Why is that? Well, remember, bases are proton acceptors. They take in hydrogen and remove it from solution. So here we can see it doing that. Here's the non-ionized form, the NH2, and it's going to rearrange its electrons in a tricky way so that it can take in this hydrogen and stick it onto itself. That gives us this ionized form. We get the plus sign because the hydrogen lacked an electron. So it becomes NH3+. Because it's removing hydrogen, it's acting as a base. Now, amino groups are hydrophilic. That means polar and water soluble. And we often find these guys in amino acids. In fact, that's what that word amino refers to. There are a couple of different ways to draw an amine or an amino group. Here's one way. You can have an X attached to an N. You can draw it to show the bonds between all the hydrogens if you like, and it will either be an NH2 or sometimes an NH3, and you put a plus, ooh, it's disappearing, on the nitrogen. An abbreviated way to draw this is just an X attached to an NH2 or an NH3 plus. Here are a couple of examples of molecules that contain amine groups. On the left, we have lysine again. That's an amino acid. So the name amino acid should tell you that there's an amino group. And it's located right here. There's NH2. If you look closely, it also has one on the end of its carbon tail down here. There's an NH2 as well. On the right, we have a molecule known as ATP. You're going to learn all about ATP. It's a major energy source for cells. But if you look at it really closely, it has an amine group here, right there. Next, we have the sulfhydryl group. As the name implies, this group involves a sulfur bound to a hydrogen, sulfhydryl. It's found on this molecule right here. And in this molecule down here, we see a sulfhydryl right there, sulfur and hydrogen. Now, sulfur is not terribly electronegative. So we consider sulfhydryl groups to be slightly polar, but not really. They're right on the border between something that's hydrophilic and hydrophobic. It's okay to know that sulfhydryl groups don't attract water very well. Now, one of the interesting things that molecules with sulfhydryl groups can do is form disulfide bonds or disulfide bridges. Here we have two separate molecules that are doing that. The sulfurs have lost their hydrogens, and they are getting together and making a covalent bond. That's called a disulfide bridge. This is one of the major bonds that helps hold your proteins together. Molecules that contain sulfhydryl groups are sometimes called thiols. Sulfhydryl groups are really easy to draw. You just start with an R or an X attached to a sulfur, attached to a hydrogen. Or you can, ooh, that's terrible. You can abbreviate that as an X attached to a sulfur, attached to a hydrogen. You don't always have to show the covalent bonds between these two at the end. In this diagram, we have two cysteine molecules making a disulfide bridge. Cysteines are amino acids, and they happen to contain sulfhydryl groups. There's one. Here's another one on a separate amino acid right there. And you can see that they've lost their hydrogen, so they're making this disulfide bridge here. That's linking them together. The phosphate group is the largest and most complex functional group that we're going to look at. Here's its chemical formula, PO4 2 negative. And you can see that when it's drawn out, it does have a phosphorus in the middle that's surrounded by oxygens. It does tend to be anionic because at least one of those oxygens will have a negative symbol on it. Now, phosphate groups are hydrophilic, so they do like to mix with water, and they're especially important because they are very energy dense. They're used for energy storage in cells, particularly inside this molecule known as ATP, which we'll talk about more in Chapter 5. You can also find phosphate groups in DNA and in RNA. I'm going to show you a very simplified way of drawing a phosphate group. Now, this may not work for all chemistry classes, but it will work for us. You start with an X and a bond and the letter P. If it has a phosphorus atom in the middle, that's going to be a phosphate group for our purposes. We'll look at this in more detail in a later chapter. But for now, as an example, here we have a section of DNA that is laid out flat. And if you look very closely, you'll notice here's a phosphate group. Here's a phosphate group. Over here, there's another one. There's another one there. Phosphate groups are important inside DNA and RNA because they form the backbones of these molecules. They help hold everything together. Now, last but not least, we have the methyl group. Methyl groups consist of a carbon bound to 2 or 3 hydrogens, depending on how it's formed, and then it will be bound to something else. There's that R. Here we have a methyl group attached to this carbon ring. Now, methyl groups are the most common functional group in organic molecules because of that carbon. You find them all over the place. Methyl groups are not particularly reactive. They are not hydrophilic. In fact, they are very hydrophobic, very nonpolar. They tend to repel water. As with the amine or amino group, there are a couple of different ways to draw a methyl group. Always start with an X attached to a C. Oh, if I can do it quickly enough, H3, bond, bond, bond with a plus sign. Or you could abbreviate that XCH3. You could also show a CH2 in the same way. Here we have a couple of fatty acids. Fatty acids, as you can imagine, are very, very nonpolar, very hydrophobic. They do not like to mix with water. Why is that? Well, let's look at it. There's a methyl on the end of the chain. Here's a methyl, here's a methyl, here's a methyl, and so on. These are all methyl groups, and they are all nonpolar, so they don't like to mix with water. And that's the reason that fats and oils generally do not like to mix with water. You can see the same thing in this unsaturated fatty acid down here as well.